Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This is Dean Woodbeck from InCommon, and I'd like to welcome you to our Baseline Expectations webinar, and I will turn it over to Brett Bieber from the University of Nebraska, who is also the chair of the group, the CTAB group you see there on your screen that is developing the Baseline Expectations. Brett, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Dean. Hello, everybody. This is Brett Bieber, as Dean mentioned, from the University of Nebraska. Here to talk to you about baseline expectations. The title on the slide here, The Federation Doctor Will See You Now. Metadata health checks are here. And I'm hoping some of you may have received some emails about the health of your entities, where we can talk a little bit more today about what that means and continue our discussion about baseline expectations. Also with me, and Nick today is going to be doing most of the talking, but I'm really excited to present with Nick. Nick and I have been colleagues for a number of years, back when Nick was at Iowa, and then at Penn State, and now with InCommon. And I'm really excited to be working with Nick on this project because InCommon has been helping as the community has built these baseline expectations. InCommon has been doing a lot of the legwork to make some of this real and make it happen. So I'm really excited to be presenting today with Nick, and we'll be talking to you today about the metadata health checks. I also want to mention that this is a three-part series. So last month, it was just about a month ago, Tom Barton, Ann West, and I gave a presentation on baseline expectations and how they impact you. And in that webinar, we went through what the baseline expectations were, what some of the thinking was about developing the baseline expectations, what would the benefits be for an IDP or an SP in the Federation, and what role did the Federation operator have to play? And so if you're interested in catching that one, Dean, if you wouldn't mind putting the link to the IAM online, there's a recording of it available so you can watch that previous webinar. But today we're here to talk to you about the health checks. And as we mentioned before, there's three parties in this, and the Federation operator also has a role to play. And one of the ways that InCommon will be facilitating that role is helping us with automatically monitoring some elements of baseline expectations that we can check and are easy or simple to verify. And with that introduction, Nick, can you please help us, Dr. Nick?
Sure. Thanks for the nice introduction, Brett. So I always like to start off this kind of thing with kind of just getting an idea of where the audience sits. So we've prepared some quick polls. I'm asking to put those out there. Thanks. And if you could just kind of go in there and answer these, we'll give you a couple minutes to answer them and start to get some results. I always love this part of these things because it's kind of fun to get real-time data and see what's going on out there. So it looks like we have a large number of InCommon site admins, at least one InCommon exec. Let's see here. A good number of people, most people who are answering so far got an email about metadata and baseline on Monday when we sent that out. Again, a good number of people know what to do. So that's awesome. That puts us in a good position for the rest of the discussion. And then, do you operate an IDP or an SP? And I see a pattern emerging here that's pretty familiar. There's a lot of people on this webinar who operate IDPs, a few less who run SPs, and that's okay. Over time, we hope to drive up the number of people that are aware of this to include pretty much everybody who's got metadata in InCommon. So we hope to see a lot of people from both categories. Okay, so thanks everybody, and Dean, if you want to clear those out, and I'll get on to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to be covering a lot today, and I'll probably go fairly fast. I want to give time to cover questions at the end. But if you miss anything, if there's things you want to go drill into the documentation on, please go check out this link, and we'll repeat this link again at the end of the presentation. And as Brett mentioned, this will be available offline as well later. So we have you covered if you miss anything. Okay, so Brett mentioned 3 roles. Baseline expectations covers these 3 different roles that come together to provide trustworthy operations across the fabric of the Federation. And each of these roles has a very important part to play in making sure that the transactions are trustworthy and that people can get them done in a way that is user-friendly and sort of levels the playing field for everyone involved. So what are baseline expectations? Really, they're just that. They're what's advertised on the box. They should be very low barrier to entry things that we start off with that everyone should be able to achieve, and that gives the community operating inside of the InCommon Federation a good amount of trust in each other's operations, practices, et cetera. And it's really meant to replace the InCommon POP that we actually are still asking people to update. We'll eventually decommission the POP, but rather this is stuff that's much more able to be measured, and it's more practical to use. So that's why we're doing baseline expectations. So we'll start off with the identity provider role. There's a lot of people in the polls that said that they were running identity providers. So what do you have to do as a person who's running an IDP and has that IDP's metadata listed in InCommon to be in compliance or to meet baseline expectations? Well, your IDP needs to be operated with organizational level authority. In other words, that IDP should be authoritative for the identities at that organization. It's pretty straightforward, and the idea there is, that your IDP is, preferably one IDP for your entire organization, and it's run by central IT or some other similar organization that's responsible for managing the identities that it represents. Then that it's trusted enough to be able to conduct business with the organization's own systems. So this is basically a golden rule. Do unto others as you would do unto yourselves. You want to make sure that you're operating that IDP in such a way that you would use it to run your own sensitive business. And just a very common sense thing, apply generally accepted security practices to the IDP. Keep it patched, up to date. Keep the newest version of the federating software running on it, underlying operating system, et cetera. And we don't define what that means specifically in baseline, and that's for a reason. We really don't want to get over prescriptive. This is really a sniff test that you need to do on your own deployment to make sure that you would trust your own deployment for your own business again. And then the third thing, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this today because this is what we're actually measuring, is that your metadata is accurate, complete, and includes technical, administrative, security contacts, MDUI information, and a privacy policy URL. And there's a similar set of expectations for service providers, although they're slightly different because the service provider is the recipient of identity information in the transaction. So you need to make sure that controls are in place to secure information and maintain user privacy, and that information received from the IDPs is not shared with third parties without permission. And obviously, it's stored only when necessary for, say, the application that you're running to be able to function. Those two things, the first two things, kind of go hand in hand. The third one is very similar to the standard for the IDP with security practices. Keep it patched. Interpret that as makes sense to you. And that, again, that your federation metadata is accurate, complete, et cetera. Again, that's something we're going to be talking a lot about today. And the fifth piece is that you need to let people know what attributes are required to obtain service from that service provider. And if you have a contract, like say it's a bilateral relationship, that's fine. But if it's a multilateral application, it should really endeavor to let everyone know what those things are in an easy to understand way. And there's ways to do that in metadata. And then as Brett mentioned, there's expectations for the federation operator. We have a pretty big role to play in this program. We need to focus on the trustworthiness of the federation as a primary objective and be transparent about such efforts. And that's actually what this program is all about. It's making sure that the federation achieves a common level of security and transparency. and trustworthiness. We have to apply generally accepted security practices to our infrastructure. We have to follow practices to ensure the accuracy and authenticity of the metadata that you entrust to us and to make sure that that is handled in a secure way, and that it in turn can be trusted. And then we need to use frameworks like entity attributes, things like the Certify Assurance Framework, research and scholarship entity category, to sort of increase the level of trust in participation in the Federation. And we need to kind of promulgate this across Federation, other federations, with our contacts with other Federation operators and through editing. So really, what does that all boil down to? It's basically an honor code. There's stuff that you as a Federation participant are on your honor to do. There's stuff that the Federation operator is on its honor to do. There are things that we can check for in your metadata, and we're going to check those things. We actually are already checking them. And we'll be exposing those problems to you. But you should reflect on everything covered in Baseline that's relevant to you. And so not just those things that we can actually automatically check, but you should do a gap analysis on your metadata and the entities that you have published in InCommon and make sure that they meet expectations, because there are some things we just can't check for you. So here are the things we're going to check. As is mentioned in the sort of rules for conformance with baseline expectations, there are some metadata elements we're going to start checking. The privacy policy URL is explicitly mentioned, and then there are some metadata user interface elements like display name, logo URL, and then some contact elements. These are basically things that the Community Trust Assurance Board and InCommon staff have worked together to identify as things that are fairly easy to check and things that help improve communication across the Federation and help improve the user experience. And thus, these are the things we'll be telling you about to start with, at least. So why are those particular elements important? The MDUI elements that are mentioned in the baseline expectations requirements are things that help your Federation partners to provide a good user experience to their users, to your users. Things like the name of the system. So in the case of a service provider, something that the users can recognize, say in an attribute consent display that the IDP might show to them to say, this is the system that you're going to be taken to. And these are the pieces of user information I'm going to release to that system. Are you okay with that? Similarly, a logo, and that allows for identity provider logos. It allows service providers to display an IDP discovery interface that is much more easy for users to navigate and for them to more readily identify their IDP. There's a lot of IDPs. There's like thousands of IDPs in the Federation metadata these days. So having additional information that helps users pick theirs out, that always helps. And for service providers, similarly, for things like consent interfaces, that logo, when provided for service providers, helps users understand, who they're giving their data to. A privacy policy URL, and we require that both for service providers and for identity providers as part of Baseline. There are, because of the sensitive nature of identity data, obviously service providers should be providing, customers with their privacy policy. But as an identity provider, you also want to let your users know how you're going to handle their data, and publish that in the metadata so that your Federation partners can refer to it as well. And then contact information. We'll get into more detail about those, the pieces of contact information in a little bit. So getting into the details of how we're doing the checking, there are different levels of checking that are possible. The absolute sort of entry point to this process is, do those elements exist in your metadata? And that's where we're going to start. We actually, as the emails that we sent out to site admins and execs this past Monday, that's the kind of checking we're doing. We're basically running the metadata through a process that looks for the existence of the elements that I talked about. Down the road, we'll probably start looking at things like, do those URLs actually resolve to something? And are the email addresses deliverable, or do we get bounces back from them? And then that's an indicator to us that we should tell you to do something. And we'll probably start, some months down the road, we'll start showing you that stuff in the InCommon Federation Manager interface. We'll tell you when you have contacts and metadata that bounce. We'll tell you when your logo URL doesn't resolve, things like that. And then we can actually prevent you from submitting metadata that doesn't meet baseline expectations. In the next webinar, you're going to hear more about the legal process. Once that legal process is complete and the baseline program is fully enforced, we're going to start changing the InCommon Federation Manager to tell you at the time that you touch metadata about the things that are, maybe don't meet baseline expectations, and we'll actually coach you into providing the correct items as part of that process. And there's a bunch of nice-to-haves that aren't actually required by baseline, but we'll probably start telling you about those things at some point too. Things like the dimensions of a logo, what they probably should be to display correctly on a discovery interface. Some recommendations around format, like it should be a PNG, it should be roughly square, it should have an alpha channel so the background can be displayed on a different color interface, et cetera. And maybe Qualys SSL grading for things like endpoints. That's all possible. So how are we doing this today? The initial implementation is really, really simple and straightforward. We basically have an XML style sheet that we apply to the production metadata every day. And that creates a set of match data that we merge with contacts that we extract from the Federation Manager for site admins and execs. And then we do basically a glorified mail merge. And we'll be sending that out once a month to begin with. We don't want to drown people in background noise, so we're gonna try and be judicious about this, but we do want to give you the opportunity to see changes in your metadata as you update things. I'll also be publishing the XSLT, the style sheet with instructions on how to run it against the metadata yourself. So if you make a change, you'll actually be able to check that yourself. And then, as I mentioned, further on down the road, we'll be telling you about the status of your metadata in the Federation Manager. Eventually, like within the next 3 or 4 months, we'll start a process to notify the Community Trust Assurance Board, which Brett is the chair of, on metadata that repeatedly has not changed and does not meet baseline expectations. And then they have a process that they've developed for arbitrating that and reaching out to people that need to modify their metadata to make it conform with baseline expectations. And there are escalation paths up to the ultimate InCommon governance body, which is InCommon steering as needed. And like I said, we'll be telling you about all this stuff in the Federation Manager as well. So here's what the raw data looks like. Every time you run the process, we're extracting that data into an Amazon DynamoDB table. We're actually in the process of migrating InCommon operations into Amazon where we can. So this is one small piece of that. DynamoDB provides pretty cheap storage and very fast performance, and it's a nice, effective way to store the data, and that'll allow us to get trend lines over time and see how things are improving as the program progresses. So this is what will the notifications look like. It should probably say what do the notifications look like, because we did send out the first set of notifications on Monday, but it appears to be an email from Ann West, who's the Executive Director of InCommon and AVP for Trust and Identity Services. And that's to help get your attention, because you really do need to do something about this if you receive these emails. And then it goes to the site administrators and the execs. And you'll only receive this email if your metadata has elements, any of your entities that you publish has elements that don't meet baseline expectations, and we'll tell you whether they meet or not in those columns. We've already gotten some good feedback from the first round of things, and we're going to be modifying this. We'll probably make it an HTML mail so that table doesn't look weird on mail clients that don't use monospaced font, et cetera. So we're going to, we're open to feedback, and we're going to be changing things as we go and making things better. So I'm going to pause for a second and turn things back over to Brett to talk through the data that we see today.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. As Nick mentioned, he's able to generate the stats pretty easily because he's just running a style sheet on our metadata XML file. So the output is very simple, and it was something that I could actually just drop into Google Sheets and build some graphs off of. So I wanted to share some of those results with you all, just some aggregated overall data results of the baseline expectations for those automatically verifiable items, and just let you know where we're at. So this here is a stacked bar chart, and for those of you who get confused by these things like I do, the way that it reads is we have the service providers in blue, the identity providers in green, and the results of both of them and meeting each of those metadata elements are actually stacked one on top of the other. It's not layered behind, they're just stacked on top of each other. So in terms of the federation and how many numbers of entities, the InCommon Federation actually has about 4,100 service providers and just over 500 identity providers. And so if you look at the first column here, display name, the blue, we're near 4,000. We are at 4,000. So if we only had, about 100 more service providers that had a display name, we would be perfect on the service providers. And if we had that 500 or so, and actually I think we are perfect on IDPs and meeting display name, that whole stack there would add up to the total in the federation that we have right now, which when I ran the stats was 4,674. So right now we're doing really good on display name. That's a very simple one, and as Nick mentioned, obviously having a display name is really helpful for discovery and identifying what's either what identity provider you need to find or what the service is that you're logging into. So a good example of that is when you go to log into a service, you're taken back to your identity provider and it says, hey, user, you are going to log into the service named, and then it can display the name of the service right there. So that's an example of user experience. But on display name, I think we're doing really well. As far as the logos, service providers, we don't have very many service providers that have a logo. Identity providers we do, but service providers, that's a challenge there. And one of the things that we will be using with the Community Trust and Assurance Board with this data is guiding us for what type of advice do we need to provide to the community around these aspects. If we have a lot of people that are really struggling with logo, can we give them some advice? Here's how to talk to your communication staff. Here's a sample of what another institution is using to develop service provider logos for the entire array of services that they have registered in the metadata. Similarly, on the privacy policy, we've got some challenges there. Admin and technical contacts, those are doing pretty good. Technical contact, obviously, we are technical people, and so we're probably comfortable putting a name inside the technical contact. Administrative, some people may be cautious, and I don't want to put so-and-so's name inside the public metadata. Is he going to receive calls? So that may be some of the hesitation there, but just interesting data here. And then security contact. We're seeing that grow over time, but as Tom Barton and I mentioned in the first webinar on baseline expectations and the impact, moving beyond baseline, having a security contact and complying with Certify is becoming more and more important to our federation. So the next set of graphs I have actually show you the percentage, which I think is a little more digestible by someone who's looking at these stats trying to see where are we at. I have the same colors here. The royal blue is service providers and the green is identity providers. And then the percentage, how many of the service providers and identity providers meet that specific element. And again, doing great on display name, doing really good on technical contact. The thing that helps when looking at this data through this lens is that we can see that identity providers are more willing to share that admin contact, about twice as much as the service providers. So when you look at this data through different lenses, if you look at it through the identity provider's perspective, you may get different sets of data and advice that we may need to provide to the community than if you look at it through the service provider lens. Yeah, go ahead.
Jump in here to talk a little bit about the bars where we've got like almost 100% compliance. Those are actually things we require in the Federation Manager. We require at least one contact. We don't say what kind, but it defaults to that contact. And we require service providers to have a display name. And then IDPs just do because they inherit the organizational display name if you don't modify it. So this also kind of shows the positive effect that us requiring things in the Federation Manager had. So I think as we start to implement these checks in the FM, we'll drive these bars up quite a bit more as well over time.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. The next graph I have is really telling about where we're currently at. So the previous diagrams, the charts showed us on each individual level, well, overall, how many service providers in InCommon and how many identity providers meet those automatically verifiable items of baseline expectations. And when we ran this data on Monday, 6.7% of the entire Federation portion of service providers meet. And for IDPs, 1.8% of our Federation. So the numbers here really tell us and highlight the need for baseline expectations. There are some significant gaps in the user experience that we have, and also the trustworthiness of our Federation. If you look at the automatically verifiable items of baseline expectations, this chart helps demonstrate the need for baseline expectations, and will also give us a model, something to chart over time. How well can we make those graphs go up and increase and get everyone as close as we can to meeting those elements of baseline as high as we can. 100% would be ideal. So another interesting way of looking at this data, as Nick mentioned, some elements are already required, but looking at the data through this lens, how many specific elements are people missing? And in the first column here, the stats that I wanted to share with you are that we have hundreds of entities that are only missing one element of baseline expectations. So it might be the logo, or it might be the technical contact or the admin contact, but they're only missing one element of baseline expectations. So if they can just add that one element inside the Federation Manager, we can have hundreds of entities that are meeting baseline expectations. Similarly, for having two elements that are missing, there are over 500 entities in the Federation that only have two items that they need to go into the Federation Manager and make adjustments to or add. But we do have some challenges. I will say 4 elements missing. That is our largest number right now. Over 2,264 entities are missing 4 elements, which would be contacts, logos, names, a whole array of things that they may be missing. And as Nick mentioned, over time, we hope to be able to plot some of this and examine, how are we doing over time? The nice thing about the way that Nick has implemented the stats generation is that it's using the metadata, which is actually archived. So we have historical metadata, and as he mentioned, with the monthly reports and also just going through time, we'll be able to generate these stats and monitor our progress as we go. So I'm really excited about being able to, understand this. What we have right now is our starting point, and then monitor our progress and provide continuing support through the Community Trust and Assurance Board to the community on how to fill in those gaps, how to add in those missing elements, whether it be how to write a privacy policy that works for your institution, or as Nick was talking about, how do I get a logo in there that is going to be meaningful to an end user when they try and interact with my service or identity provider. So there's a sample of all of the data that we've got. One other lens that I wanted to show you all, which I think is just interesting as well, is since this is just a simple check of the metadata, we can also look at the data in EduGain, the global federation. So in this chart here, we have side by side InCommon registered entities and non-InCommon entities. And as you can see, we have a significant advantage in the privacy policy, admin contact, and security contact area. We're doing better than all of the global entities out there in those specific areas. Technical contact, not so much, but those are really high already. You know, those are in the 80 to 90% ranges for display names and technical contacts. But this is another interesting way to look at the data, and also highlights the need for continuing to push baseline expectations not only within InCommon, but globally with all of the other federations that are out there. So with that, why don't I hand it back over to Nick, talk about the notifications.
Thanks, Brett. Okay, so, and again, some of these questions have been asked and answered over in the chat, but I'll go over those answers again. Somebody had asked, you know, who's going to receive these notifications or who has received them, and it's primarily directed at InCommon site admins, since those are the people that can actually take action to update their metadata, and there's a CC to InCommon execs. Those people are what we refer to as named roles. In the case of the executive, the first executive that an organization names is named in that organization's InCommon participation agreement. Over time, that can change. The executive could ask to have a new executive name, say that executive is changing roles or something. But in any case, it's up to that named executive to appoint site admins, and they work with the InCommon registration authority staff to do that. At the bottom of the slide, I have a link to the website that you can go to find out more about how to change those roles. And it's important as we proceed along the baseline expectations program that both your exec and your site admins are kept up to date. The exec, in order to make sure that the site admins basically are kept up to date and that we have a clear communication path, and that we can work with you to get your metadata updated. We actually encourage, as part of this process, we encourage the site admins and the execs to get together and talk about what baseline expectations means, and if there's anything that you need to do. Say you need to go and identify a privacy policy for your organization that's appropriate to list, or you might need to talk through use of a logo and maybe talk to your marketing people, and hopefully your exec can help you do that. And so when you receive these emails, you should actually see, you should see in that email who the other people are, who the other site admins and execs are. And you can, if you're a site admin, you can log into the InCommon Federation Manager and see who your executives are as well.
Hey, Nick, there was a question in chat about notifying delegated admins.
Yes. So delegated admins are appointed by the InCommon site admins, and we would ask that you get in contact with your delegated admins. The site admins are actually responsible for assigning specific pieces of SP metadata to their delegated admins. So you should know, you should be able to go into the interface and see who those delegated admins are and see what entities are assigned to them. And then you should get in contact with those people and ask them if there's things that need to get changed. Obviously, as a site admin, you can change those things on behalf of those people, or you can ask them to submit delegated changes. Does that cover it?
Yeah, so no plans right now to notify the delegated admins automatically. Site admins should pass those reports on to those delegated admins.
They should, and we're probably going to be looking at the way that we do delegated metadata administration in the future. It's in desperate need of an overhaul. We don't know what the time frame is for that, but we will probably be changing that to make it easier for site admins to manage, easier for delegated admins to get access to the metadata they need, et cetera. We're just not quite there yet. And we'll probably show delegated admins the compliance of their metadata at the time they submit it along with site admins when we make that change.
Great. Thanks, Nick.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of information should you put in the contacts, the three contact types that I mentioned that are going to be required? And basically, again, it says what's on the box. And we don't go into a huge amount of detail about telling you what those things should be, although I understand that the C tab is going to be publishing some guidance on these kinds of things. But really, it's, if I have an administrative issue with your IDP or SP, who do I get in contact with? If I have a technical issue, say I need to do key rollover and I need to know who to contact that can help me with that. Maybe out of band, I've got an emergency situation or something like that. Who do I contact? And then security contacts. If I need to report a security incident or inquire about something that I see that might be suspicious, who do I get in contact with? And again, these things, we encourage people not to use people's email addresses in those. They should be things like mail aliases, mail groups, lists. And that way you can keep them pointed at the right people without having to touch metadata. As people change roles at your org, you can just update those aliases or lists. Okay, so let's see. And then the URL, so logo URL and the privacy statement URL. Again, these are things that we'll just be checking whether they exist or not to begin with. But there are some things that you should probably do to make them more nicely usable. We do want you to specify the height and width of the logo that you submit so that the interfaces can size it appropriately. They can resize it if they need to. And the URL is actually checked right now to make sure that it's HTTPS to ensure that it doesn't cause warnings when it's used in a discovery interface. It's protected with HTTPS or consent interface. So it's important that you do that. The privacy URL, it's likely something that either, if you're from a sponsored partner, your company probably has a privacy policy that you can just link to in there. If you're an IDP operator, again, I urge you to talk to your exec, your leadership, and find out, does your organization have just a boilerplate privacy policy that you can point users at? And that would probably be something appropriate to put in there. Display name. Like I said, for IDPs, we populate that for you by default with the name of your organization, the legal name of your organization. Since last year, we've allowed IDPs to modify that. So if you're the Ohio State University and you want to just change it to Ohio State University, you can do that. Service providers, it's important that you fill this in because the name of your service usually does not equal your organization. So we do not default populate that for you, and you should put a value in there that means something to users. And we have a wiki page that will tell you more. Actually, this is part of a vast wiki space of documentation about metadata that you could probably explore for hours, if not days. But it has quite a lot of good guidance on what should go into these elements. So go check that out, mark it, and you can use that as a reference when you're going through updating this stuff. Yeah, let's see. So what can you do to act? If you're a site administrator, go into the Federation Manager. This is the URL for it. Log in with your credentials. And then you'll see this interface. Because of the dimensions of the slide, I chopped off the top of this, but you'll actually see who your exec is up here at the top of the screen in big letters. It tells you who that person is. And then you can see who the other site administrators are, and if you have other roles, which is fairly rare, you'll see what those other roles are. And then you can update your metadata. These dashboards for identity providers and service providers, this is probably the location where we'll start showing you the baselininess or not of your metadata over time. Probably show you something like a green light, yellow light, red light, traffic light type thing. And then a link you can click to learn more about the details. If you need to update one of these, click the little pencil update icon, and that should take you into the interface to update your metadata. Then you can go into, there's a couple different sections, one for user interface elements and one for contacts, and those are the sections to pay attention to as part of this process. Make sure that each of your entity descriptors, each IDP or SP metadata contains the required parts documented at that link. And this is that link takes you to a really nice grid that our DevOps manager, Dave Schaefer, put together that tells you sort of the musts and the shoulds in a really nice, concise format. And it gives you an idea of some of the elements that we're going to be checking in the Federation Manager, how we'll be doing that in the future as well. you can click the edit link under the user interface elements section to modify that. If you need to add a missing contact, you can click add. You can also update and delete those things. So this is what the user interface elements section looks like and the contacts. So that's it for the scripted content portion of this. I'll turn it back over to Brett to kind of ringlead the discussion and question and answer section, and I'll be here to help answer questions.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Nick. Thanks for walking us through that and also just giving some tips on how to access and edit the metadata that you have inside the Federation Manager. So that's sort of a action item or a to-do item for all of site admins. If they can log into the Federation Manager, take a look at those entities that you have registered and see if there's anything you can do right away. Hopefully there's some simple items that you can make changes to. I actually was monitoring a chat from Angie at InCommon, and she mentioned that I think yesterday, Tuesday, we had 55 metadata submissions, and then I think today we have 53. So a significant amount of change has already started because of the mailings that were sent out, and so I think we're going to be making really good progress towards increasing those charts. Taking a look at those charts and giving everyone a little bit more confidence that everything's moving in the right direction. And just within the last couple of days, just seeing those numbers of the reports come in, that's been very helpful, and at least affirmation that people are responding, they're receiving the messages, and I think in terms of the poll that, Dean, thank you for putting that out as we started, a lot of people know what to do. They know how to fix these elements. It's not difficult. They can go inside the Federation Manager and they can make the changes pretty easily. There may be some others where we need to have some guidance, as we mentioned. What's a privacy policy? I saw Scott's comments in the chat. What if the privacy policy doesn't necessarily talk about federated scenarios? Is that okay to use that? And there's a lot of things like that people will have to be thinking through and taking a look at their own operations and seeing what works for themselves. But it's encouraging for me to see the number of metadata submissions, even with just that first email going out. Nick also mentioned that these reports, they'll be sending the emails out monthly until we have some other mechanism where people can automatically, do some reports on their own or have some access within the Federation Manager. But we plan on doing these emails out to the execs and site admins monthly. So we've done ours for February, but in March we will have another one. So with that, does anyone have any questions that are coming up? It looks like Tom is keeping on top of the questions that are coming in.
Yeah, Brett, I think there was one that did not get answered earlier on, and it was about, will there be enforcement of existing members at some point in the future, i.e. removal for noncompliance?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Thank you, Dean, for relaying that one if it scrolled by. One of the things about Baseline is that this is giving our Federation the ability to take an actor that isn't meeting our own community-defined standards and remove them from the Federation. So the baseline expectations, when it becomes active, there will be a pathway to remove an entity if it does not meet our baseline expectations. Now, that's not the goal. The goal here isn't to remove people from the Federation. It's to elevate that trust level and to elevate everyone within our community. So we don't want this to be like a gotcha, where, you didn't put a logo in, so we're going to pull you out of the Federation. That's not the goal of baseline expectations. The goal is to increase the usefulness of the Federation and take it from, this metadata repository into the most useful tool for higher education and research collaboration in the globe. And that's really what we're trying to do. So it's not about being able to kick people out of the Federation. It's about elevating what we have and making this a really great resource. So, all that said,
to add on to that?
yeah, go ahead, Nick.
So I had kind of just very loosely alluded to that we'll be publishing actually part of the script that we use to do this, so you can check yourself. But because there are Federation participants that don't pay as close attention to the goings-on of the Federation as all of you who are on this webinar today, we need your help to reach out to them. And so, and because a lot of those participants probably play an important role in how your systems operate, you might have, say, outsourced some service, and that service maybe, it's probably mission critical, and it may not meet baseline expectations. We want to ask for your help to reach out to those folks and steer them towards this program and get them aware of it and get them paying attention to their inbox and get them paying attention to the reporting and helping to correct their metadata, so that we do not, like Brett said, we do not want to remove entities from the Federation. The goal is to have 100% coverage.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Nick. And also, just thinking back to the poll that Dean had, the majority of participants in our webinars are IDP operators. Almost twice as many IDP operators are present here today than service provider operators. But if you look at the data for how many entities we have in our Federation, we have a huge number of service providers. So as Nick mentioned, that's a really good point. Let's see if we can reach out to those service providers, perhaps others that are registering service providers on behalf of us in the Federation because they were the owners of the domain where that was hosted. Reach out to those partners and make sure they're aware of baseline expectations. I think that'll be really important as we go forward. But with regards to the question about, what may be the timing, and we actually put in an FAQ on this, and there's an FAQ that was linked in the message that was sent out that answers some of these questions, but there is a well-defined process by which we will notify the community if we intend to remove an entity's metadata or alter it from the Federation. And that process is likely not going to be in effect until the participation agreement has been approved by InCommon steering and the 90-day notification period has finished. So there's months and months before anything like that would happen. But our goal would be, if we identify an entity that is having trouble meeting some of these baseline expectations, we're going to be reaching out directly to them and trying to contact them as best as we can to make sure that they have the resources they need to meet the community's baseline expectations.
Well, and I should probably point out too, Brett, that next month on the March 7th webinar, we're going to touch on some of these issues like community consensus and dispute resolution in more detail.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The next webinar, and I think we actually have a slide on that. So we've done the first two, baseline, how they impact you, metadata health checks with Nick today, and then the next one will be on policy and legal changes. And Ann West is going to be helping with that webinar March 7th, so make sure you try and attend that one. But we'll be looking forward to watching the metadata and seeing it increase over time, all the accuracy and having good contact information. So that'll be great.
I wonder too if I see a question from David Vance about Certify and self-assessment. And Nick, I don't know, could you spend maybe 2 minutes on Certify?
Sure. Yeah, so Certify is actually further up in the chat. You'll see I put a URL in there to go read more about the program. Basically, Certify is a very low barrier to entry security incident response framework, specifically tailored to help multilateral, say, collaborative types of applications and identity providers, but others as well, collaborate across the Federation to collectively resolve security incidents that impact multiple sites and multiple applications. And it's just like it says, it's a self-assessment. It's got some very practically minded things, sort of along the same lines as the baseline expectations requirement that your IDP or SP or Federation operation infrastructure is run with good security practices in mind. Certify adds just a little bit to that about being able to need to actually respond to an incident that gets reported in a fairly timely manner. It's not too onerous. And then if you've got a security contact in metadata and you think you can meet those pretty easy to meet requirements, you should go into the Federation Manager and check that somewhat confusing checkbox. I apologize for the confusing nature of that. We'll probably fix that at some point. But basically, if that for each entity, if the entity complies with Certify, at a minimum, if you have the security contact there and then you self-assert that that thing meets Certify, then you can check that checkbox. And once you've submitted metadata, that checkbox will be checked, and it will actually what's displayed next to it will actually change to say this this entity complies with Certify. Right now, if it's unchecked, it says this entity does not comply. So if you check it, it will change to say it complies. And then that actually is one of the first entity attributes that we have where it totally bypasses the InCommon RA approval queue because it's totally self-asserted. If you meet the things that we can mechanically check, which is the security contact and metadata, you're just automatically approved. You've got that. That change just goes through. And we hope to do more things like that in the future to allow more timely metadata submissions.
Yeah, another aspect of that that's really important is that, baseline is a piece of this, but really to expand your ability to collaborate with entities within the Federation, you don't have to stop at baseline. And I think Tom Barton mentioned in our last webinar the importance of the research and scholarship entity category support and making sure that you release attributes to those service providers that are in that category. He mentioned Certify as well, and also the multi-factor authentication interoperability profile, other ways that you can elevate the trust that entities would have, or parties can have between your IDP and the SP. So baseline isn't about everything. It's not everything that is of importance in the Federation, but this is the bar where we have it today and where we want to get it to. And I see Jerry's comment here about, if we're really having trouble with this sort of easy to accomplish checks, how will we ensure that we have compliance, or are you concerned about compliance or meeting those baseline expectations where the requirements are a little more fuzzy? I would say right now I'm not too concerned about that. We really have just begun the communications campaign around baseline expectations and informing people what it means to meet some of these specific items that we can automatically check, giving them an opportunity to actually see this one doesn't meet this specific area. That is really helpful. And in many cases, I'm sure that we will see the data show this. People will just be able to add in a contact, add in those pieces of data very easily, and they're likely already doing the generally accepted security practices and other aspects that baseline expectations just gives us a mechanism to formally, say that every entity meets a certain expectation, and a mechanism and a route for a participant that has a concern with another party's operations to be able to escalate that and then achieve a desired result of that, which may be removing someone from the Federation or altering their metadata if they don't comply with RNS, for example. So Nick also mentions here baseline expectations with regards to security and running IDP software that is out of date. And so that's an interesting aspect and really helpful, for us to discuss. When we want to meet security, elements of security, how do we do that, and how do we verify it remotely if we wanted to? I don't know that we even want to get into that point of checking for other aspects of security. But I think it was Ann or maybe Tom in the chat who gave a really good piece of advice there. If you have questions about security, talk with your security team and give their advice. Don't ask InCommon to give you advice on some overall security program. Talk to your security folks and get their advice and see if they can provide some guidance to you on that. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, I would just want to thank Nick wholeheartedly from the Community Trust and Assurance Board. The amount of work that you put into at least getting us where we are today with the ability to notify participants and getting the word out about baseline expectations, and also the roadmap that you have for making changes to the Federation Manager and allowing the community to increase their trust in each other. I'm really grateful for that. So thank you, Nick, and thanks to the rest of the folks at InCommon that have been helping make baseline expectations a real way of increasing our trust in each other. So thank you very much, Nick.
Thanks, Brett. I'd like to take the opportunity to say that we absolutely could not have done this without the help of our DevOps manager, Dave Schaefer, and security lead, Shannon Roddy, both of whom we were able to hire due to increased participation fees from the InCommon community. So thank you all.
Yes, thank you. And with that, Dean?
Okay, well, thank you, Brett, and thank you, Nick. Good presentation, and Brett, also for your leadership of the CTAB and for this whole baseline expectations initiative. So I'll remind again, you can see on your screen our next webinar is on March 7th, where we'll dig into more of these policy, legal, and other similar issues. And we're done for today, so thank you very much for joining us.